Hello, and welcome to the Lessons of Vietnam show today. Let's see. Yesterday, in 1995, we resumed diplomatic relations with Vietnam. So that was in 1995 yesterday. So we now resume. Today's show is going to be a continuation of a show we've been working on about the fall of Saigon. But we've been talking about the aftermath and so forth. But today we're going to be talking about the re-education camps. But let's get a formal introduction so you know who we are and so forth. We are the Lessons of Vietnam. We're an online show telling the real story of the Vietnam War and the men and women involved. We try to dispel the myths, lies, and half-truths, and misunderstandings about the Vietnam War, which is a tough thing to do. There's so much out there. We are brought to you on the second Monday of each month now at 3 p.m. And we're hosted and produced and everything else by Nissan Communications out of beautiful Raleigh, North Carolina. To see any archive shows, just go to nissancommunications.com and select on demand and then select the show from the LOV list. We got quite a list there covering about every subject you want to come up with. I am your host, Bill Dixon. I was in Vietnam in 67 and 68. I was in the headquarters company 159 Engineer Group, 20th Engineer Brigade at Long Binh Post, right up from LBJ or Long Binh Jail. We value your comments and suggestions. So if you have something that you would like to see on the show or like to be a guest, send me an email at dixonbill80@yahoo.com. We'd love to have you come on during the show. If you would dial us at 919-518-9773, or even better, come on to Skype at Computers 2K Voice. Either way, you can come on and ask us questions and make comments and so forth. We're coming out of the COVID. Of course, they're trying to scare us now with the new stuff, but a lot of veterans out there have been in crisis and their families. The Veterans Crisis Line connects veterans in crisis and their families and friends with qualified caring Department of Veterans Affairs responders. And you can talk to them by completely confidential if you would dial 1-800-273-8255 and press 1. Press 1 is important because that way you get to talk to a veteran, someone who works with veterans. Or you can send a text message to 838-255. So if you need some support, whether you're a family or veteran, please reach out. They're there waiting for us. Thank you. All right, now, as we're getting into the show, I got one other thing I want to talk to you about. The fall of Saigon was in 1975. And I'll put that picture back up, if you would, we just had. There you go. The fall of Saigon was in 1975. And are we getting ready to have another repeat of the fall of Saigon? Is it deja vu all over again? As they said in baseball, the fall of Kabul, 2021. We're going to see the tanks. As you see, the tanks busting in. You see the tanks busting in into Saigon. And we're going to have the helicopters up on the roof and so forth we had before. I just saw on the news today, and don't pay much attention to it, but the Afghanistan soldiers are throwing their weapons down and surrendering because they get $60 in order to go get bus fare back home. All right, let's see. Next, let's see. The year's events between the American pullout in Vietnam was strikingly similar to what is happening now in Afghanistan. The U.S. signed a peace deal with the enemy that cleared the path to pull out American forces, but purposely left its local allies out of the negotiations and allowed enemy troops to retain their weapons and their territory. Now, that is exactly what happened in Saigon, South Vietnamese, and that's what's actually happening today. That's a similarity. I hope it doesn't work out the same way. Can we compare Kabul with Saigon just before it fell in 1975? Are there clear differences, important similarities, maybe even lessons to be learned? Can the U.S. allies trust the word of our government in the future? All of our allies, as far as I'm concerned, are to be real careful. Today, I wonder what would happen to the young girls who went to school, dressed different than the rules allow. The people who supported the American and allied military. What would happen to the Afghan military? The years and events between American pullout were strikingly similar, but let's see. Let's go to the next one. There you go. As a Vietnam veteran in the Vietnam War, I remember my thoughts and feelings the day Saigon fell to the communists. So many emotions. Happiness, it was finally over. Shock, dismay that we had allowed the communists to come in and take over. The waste of human lives, betrayed, disgusted. We had to set the South Vietnamese people up to fail and die for our proxy war. Guilty in that I had done my best when I was there, but it wasn't obviously good enough. I dealt with so many emotions there, but I was still glad that we would not be losing a whole lot more, lives of Americans. But then we ended up next week or so doing it all over again. Today, I wonder what happened to the young girls who went to school dressed differently and so forth, the people who support the Americans. But what's going to happen to the Afghan people who had reached out and worked with Americans and so forth? That's going to be interesting. Okay, let's get into the show. Continue to look at the fall of Saigon to communist forces and its aftermath. In a speech on May 15th in 1975 by the communist leader Lee Duc-Tho, he said, "We must quickly stabilize the people's lives, maintain public order and security, and resolutely punish counter-revolutionary elements." The official newspaper of Saigon wrote in June of 1975. Reeducation camps. Now, as you see there, the pictures, that's a map of Vietnam, and those little red dots are the locations of some of the re-education camps. But I had read that it was up to 300 different camps, and I know that's not 300, but that's a lot of them. I've got friends that were in different camps who served their time. I've got one friend that served a year and a half, and I got friends that served 12 to 15 years. The new communist government quickly and quietly set up re-education camps. Re-education camps is a title given to the prison camps operated by the communist government of Vietnam following the end of the Vietnam War. In such re-education camps, the government imprisoned up to 300,000 former military officers, government workers, and supporters of the former government of South Vietnam. That's kind of a short estimate, because basically everybody in South Vietnam ended up going to some kind of re-education camp. At the fall of Saigon on April 30th, 1975, every South Vietnamese man, from former officers in the armed forces to religious leaders to employees of the Americans or the old government, were told to report to a re-education camp to learn about the ways of the new government. Many South Vietnamese people chose to flee on boats, we talked about, but others had established lives and loved ones in Vietnam, so they willingly entered these camps in hopes of quickly reconciling with the new government and continue their lives peacefully. The communist government said re-education camps would only last for 10 days and at most 2 weeks. However, once there, the men were detained for many years in grueling labor camps. Just pack your bag for the weekend. Some estimates put the number of inmates who passed through re-education camps as high as 500,000 to 1 million. Re-education, as it was implemented in Vietnam, was seen as both a means of revenge and a sophisticated technique of repression and indoctrination, which developed following the 1975 fall of Saigon. And that is a picture of some of the re-education camp people. I cannot tell you if that's from the movie Ride to Thunder, or it's actually a picture taken. There was not a whole lot of cameras in use in the re-education camp, so it's hard to tell. But I believe that might have came from the movie, which I highly recommend that you get and watch. Thousands were tortured and abused. Prisoners were incarcerated for periods ranging from weeks to 18 years. Even some of the Viet Cong guerrilla forces found themselves being forced into re-education camps, along with their former enemy, South Vietnamese military. Even though they had fought with the North Vietnamese communists, they were considered nationalists and not communists. So they had to be properly re-educated to think and be communists instead of nationalists. Rather than appointing the Viet Cong officials to become leaders of the former South Vietnam now communist government, Hanoi sent in northern communists to be leaders in the South, in effect ignoring the efforts of the VC in defeating South Vietnam. As they fought, the VC fought, they just figured they would come right on in because they were there. And not only did they end up in re-education camps, but they got passed over for the leadership. It's been estimated that between 1 and 2.5 million people entered the camps in 1975 alone under the new government's promise for a quick re-education in communist dogma. Re-education means different things to different people. To the Hanoi regime, re-education is seen as a very positive way to integrate the former enemy into the new society. It is, according to communist leaders of Vietnam, an act of mercy, since those in the camps deserve the death penalty or life imprisonment. So the mercy is by the communists, they're not going to kill them, they're just going to send them there and work them to death. The former prisoners, on the other hand, see re-education from quite a different perspective. The re-education camps were organized into 5 levels. Level 1 camps, which were called as study camps or day study centers, located mainly in major urban centers, often in public parks, and allowed attendees to return home each night. In those camps, some 500,000 people were instructed about socialism, new government policy, in order to unlearn their ways of thinking. The level 2 camps had a similar purpose as the level 1, but attendees were not allowed to return home for 3 to 6 months. Approximately 700,000 people were forced to attend both level 1 and level 2 camps. The system of re-education, according to the communists, is to follow the line of combining labor and political education, and the regimen is to include 8 hours of productive labor a day, 2 half days set aside each week for political study, with cultural classes in the evening. Those who violated camp discipline, depending on the seriousness of the violation, shall be prosecuted before a people's court of sanction administratively. A people's court of the communists. The period of education reform was set at 3 years, but allowed for early release for those who genuinely reformed, while stating that those who refused to reform would have their period of education reform extended, in effect giving those being re-educated an open-ended incarceration. It also depended on how much money your family could pay, was how much that you had got re-educated. The 3 re-education camps, known as the socialist reform camps, can be found in almost every southern Vietnam province, containing at least 50,000 inmates. Most of them were educated people and thus less susceptible to manipulation than most of the South Vietnamese in level 1 and 2 camps. Therefore, the inmates or prisoners in these camps had to suffer poor living conditions, forced labor, and daily communist indoctrination. The last 2 types of camps were used to incarcerate more dangerous Southern individuals, including writers, legislators, teachers, Supreme Court judges, province chiefs, until the South was stable to permit their release. By separating members of certain social classes, the old regime, Hanoi, wanted to prevent them from conducting joint resistance and forcing them to conform to new social norms. In 1987, at least 15,000 dangerous persons were still incarcerated, level 4 and level 5 camps. That is a stick. I'm going to explain to you what that was for. In most of the re-education camps, living conditions were inhumane. Prisoners were treated with little food, poor sanitation, and no medical care. They were assigned to do hard work and risky work, such as cleaning the jungle, constructing barracks, digging wells, cutting trees, and even minefield sweeping without necessary working equipment. That is a stick. A good friend of mine was given a stick similar to that one and was told to go out there and clear those landmines. So he had to go out there with a stick and dig them up and get them out. So why don't you blow up a few? We got plenty of prisoners. Although that hard work required a lot of energy, their provided food portions were extremely small. As an prisoner remembers, the experience of hunger dominated every man in camp. Food was the only thing they talked about. Even when they were quiet, food still haunted their thoughts, their sleep and their dreams. Worse still, various diseases such as malaria, beriberi, and dysentery were widespread in some of the camps. As many prisoners were weakened by the lack of food, those diseases could now easily take away their lives. Starvation died, overwork, disease, and harsh punishment resulted in the high death rate of the prisoners. According to academic studies of American researchers, a total of 165,000 Vietnamese people died in those camps. 165,000 people. How big is that? Well, that's about the size of Garden Grove, California, or Fort Lauderdale, Florida, or Dayton, Ohio. 165,000 or so people. That kind of give you an idea of just how many 165 is. In May of 1975, various groups of Vietnamese were ordered to register with the new regime that had established control of the South on April 30th, 1975. Then in June, the new regime issued orders instructing those who had registered in May to report to various places for re-education. Soldiers, non-commissioned officers, and rank and file personnel of the former South Vietnamese government were to undergo 3-day reform study, June 11th and 13th, in which they would attend during the day and go home at night. The others ordered to report for reform study were not allowed to attend during the day and go home at night, but were instead to be confined to their sites of reform study until the course ended. Nonetheless, there was some hope, for the government gave the clear impression that reform study would last no more than a month for even the highest ranking officers and officials of the former government in South Vietnam, and 10 days for lower ranking officers and officials. Officers of the South Vietnamese armed forces from the rank of second lieutenant to captain, along with low-ranking police officers and intelligence cadre, were ordered to report to various sites, bringing along enough paper, pens, clothing, mosquito nets, personal effects, food, or money for use in 10 days, beginning from the day of the meeting. All they had to do was be ready for 10 days. High-ranking military and police officials of the Republic of Vietnam, from major to general, along with mid and high-ranking intelligence officers, members of the Republic of Vietnam executive, judicial, and legislative branches, including all elected members of the House of Representatives and Senate, and finally, leaders of the non-communist political parties in South Vietnam were ordered to report to various sites, bringing enough paper, pens, clothing, mosquito nets, personal effects, food, or money for a month, beginning with the first meeting. Hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese were detained in re-education camps, and not for any specific individual deed, but for the act of collaborating with the other side during the war. This applies not only to top-ranking government officials and military officers of the former regime in South Vietnam, but also to more ordinary people such as medical doctors, conscripted into the army, who got drafted, who were told that in treating the sick and wounded soldiers, they had committed the crime of strengthening the puppet forces. Honors graduates who attended officers' training school as required by law and then became Republic of Vietnam Reserve military officers were also sent to the re-education camps. Others sent to camps included nearly 400 writers, poets, and journalists, and over 2,000 religious leaders, including 194 Buddhist, Catholic, and Protestant clergy, and 516 Catholic priests and fathers. The conditions varied widely in the camps. There could be found a depressing quality of similar about certain features of the re-education camps, which appear throughout. These included an emphasis on political indoctrination and mandatory confessions. During the early stages of the re-education, heavy and often dangerous physical labor and widespread disease due to the severe lack of food and medical care. Any variations occur mainly with regard to the various forms of physical mistreatment inflicted on the prisoners, but even then, there are certain features widely practiced, such as placing uncooperative prisoners and Connex boxes left behind by the United States or in dark cellars underground. And I can tell you that metal Connex boxes would get hot. Not a whole lot of air. There you see dragging a man over into the Connex boxes. And that one looks like it's made out of wood, but most of them were out of metal. But see them dragging them over. Reeducation inmates were subject to intensive political indoctrination. Subjects studied included the exploitation by America, imperialism of workers in other countries, the glory of labor, the victory of Vietnam, led by the Communist Party over the U.S., and the generosity of the new government towards the rebels. Those are the ones who fought on the other side and aided during the war. There were a total of 9 courses of variable lengths. Each course would begin with lectures from the political cadre, lasting 1 or 2 days. And following this, the inmate would divide into closely supervised groups where they would discuss the lessons over the next 5 to 7 days and write essays summarizing each lesson. Discussions will last 4 hours in the morning and 4 hours in the afternoon. In the afternoon sessions, the prisoners were required to repeat the content of the lectures. Better not go to sleep. Another feature emphasized during the early stages of reeducation, but continued throughout one's imprisonment, is confession of one's alleged misdeeds in the past. In a March 1981 memorandum to Amnesty International, the Hanoi government said in all cases of people being sent to reeducation camps, the competent Vietnamese authorities have established files recording the criminal acts committed by the people concerned. These files were established through the mandatory confessions and denunciations of others. In other words, tell stories about your neighbor. These confessions provided the government with a retroactive justification of its decision to imprison hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese in the camps. It can point out, as it did to Amnesty International, that the prisoners themselves had confessed to committing crimes. Of course, such reasoning is unlikely to convince many people outside the leadership of the Vietnamese Communist Party, but in any case, the situation provides much opportunity for false confession by the prisoners in order to satisfy their captors, as well as more ill treatment of the prisoners in order to produce confessions. All prisoners of the camps were required to write confessions, no matter how trivial their alleged crimes might be. Mail clerks, for example, were told they were guilty of aiding the puppet war machinery through circulating the mail, while religious chaplains were found guilty of providing spiritual comfort and encouragement to the enemy troops. A reserve military officer who taught Vietnamese literature in high school was told that he had misled a whole generation of innocent children. Besides confessing such crimes, prisoners had to write their autobiography and disclose their financial assets as described by a former prisoner. You had to write the story of your life, including your father, grandfather, and children, describing their fortune, how everyone died, what they owned, including television, radio, and camera. New ones had to be written twice each month, both in re-education and in prison. If they found you had left something out that you had included earlier, you were in trouble. You would have to write new confessions many times each day. Like we used to have to write on the wall, on the board. Each confession was about 20 pages handwritten. In other words, if there was a way to copy what you wrote last month, you better copy it because they're going to hold it against you. Following the written confessions were the public confessions, in which prisoners would confess their crimes before the camp authorities and other prisoners. Prisoners were encouraged to criticize each other's confessions, said a former prisoner, which was very effective in getting us to hate each other. So we could tell on each other. The more crimes a prisoner confessed, the more he is praised as progressive by camp authorities. We started making up confessions. The incessant demand for confessions placed a great deal of pressure on the prisoners, leading to insanity in some cases. A former prisoner who had previously been a medical doctor said he saw many cases of screaming, yelling people. Despite his medical experience, he was not allowed to treat them. The purpose of these confessions was not only to produce a sense of guilt in the prisoners and to establish files on them, but also to get the prisoners to denounce other former soldiers and government officials who had not yet reported to the re-education camps. The government had been very concerned about the hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese who had not yet reported. Much emphasis in the re-education camps was placed on productive labor. Such labor was described as absolutely necessary for re-education because under the former regime, the prisoners represented the upper strata of society and got rich under U.S. patronage. Because they got rich under U.S. patronage, they could but scorn the working people. Now the former social order was turned upside down. And after they had finished their stay in camps, they must earn their living by their own labor and live in society where work is held in honor. Thus, in the eyes of the Vietnamese rulers, productive labor is a necessary aspect in the overturning of the social order. Yet, in examining the conditions under which this labor takes place, it seems there is also an element of revenge. Take your stick and go out there and dig up those landmines. The labor is primarily hard physical work. Some of it is very dangerous, such as minefield sweeping. No equipment is provided for this extremely risky work, and as a result, many prisoners have been killed or wounded in minefield explosions. Other work includes cutting trees, planting corn and root crops, clearing the jungle, digging wells, latrines, and garbage pits, and constructing barracks within the camps and fences around it. The inmates are generally organized into platoons and work units, where they are forced to compete with each other for better records and work achievements. This has pushed inmates to exhaustion and nervousness, a former prisoner said. Each person and group had to strive to surpass or at least fulfill the norms set by camp authorities, or they would be classified as lazy in order to do compensation work on Sundays. In other words, if one group dug up one mine more than your group, you might be out there on Sunday doing it still. Other prisoners who missed their quota had been shackled and placed in solitary confinement cells. The duration of the work is generally been 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, which might not seem bad, except the work is done in the hot tropical sun by prisoners who are already poorly nourished and receive little or no medical care. The poor health, combined with hard work, mandatory confessions, and political indoctrination, made life very difficult for prisoners in Vietnam and has contributed to a high death rate in the camps. Since the inmates were originally told in 1975 to bring enough food for up to 30 days, food supplies were generally adequate the first few weeks, but have gradually deteriorated since that time. Prisoners interviewed in 1976 and 1977 reported that the typical diet was only 1 or 2 bowls of rice a day, with no meat and few vegetables. Since then, the diet has become even worse, shifting from rice to corn and root crops. Especially common latter in the diet is manioc, a starchy root crop which has little nutritive value other than filling one's stomach. Besides salt and water, the total amount of food for each prisoner was about 400 to 500 grams a day, and much of it is spoiled. There was virtually no protein in the diet, except on a rare occasion, perhaps 2 or 3 times a year, such as Ho Chi Minh's birthday, the Lunar New Year, or Independence Day, when the diet was supplemented by a few tiny morsels of meat. I'm going to tell you what that meat was. Under such conditions, prisoners are constantly preoccupied with food, as described in a letter smuggled out of the country. And this is the letter. In my forced labor camp in the Highland, the event that dominates everything is the experience of hunger. We are hungry permanently. All we think about day and night is eating. During the first days of the harvest season, we are allowed almost a field of corn and manioc roots. But that lasts only a few days. During these days, there are shining eyes and smiles. But very soon, the camp administrator shuts up the eating. The shining eyes and smile disappear. We feel hungry again. So hungry we think of nothing else. And it continues. Many of us catch lizards to eat. They only provided protein. Very soon the lizards on the whole area were exterminated. I know of a prisoner who one night caught a millipede on the ceiling, hid it under his mat, and in the morning roasted it on a fire and ate it. He said it was as good as roast shrimp. There are those who are very clever to invent devices to catch mice and birds. They would roast and eat them while others watch with envy. Others catch grasshoppers and crickets. Whenever someone catches a snake, that is a feast. In our conversation, we only talk about eating and how to find things to eat. When we do not talk about eating, we silently think about eating. As soon as we finish lunch, we begin to imagine the supper awaiting us when we return from the field. The food put into the mouth is like one breath of air blown into a vast empty house. What little food is given is chewed very slowly. The lack of food has caused severe malnutrition for many prisoners and weakened their resistance to various diseases. Most common among diseases are malaria, beriberi, and dysentery. Tuberculosis is also widespread in some of the camps. Medical supplies are generally non-existent in the camp, and medical care is very inadequate, usually limited to a poorly trained medic and perhaps a few prisoners who had formerly been medical doctors. The result is a high death rate from disease. A prisoner in Dam Duong camp in Hanoi province, for example, witnessed 20 deaths, including 3 cases of intestinal hemorrhage, in which prisoners died because there was no plasma. In Tuia camp, about 30 prisoners out of a camp population of 5,000 died of illness in the last 3 or 4 months. Still, it makes no difference. We feel even more hungry after eating. Even in our sleep, our dreams are haunted by food. There are those who chew noisily in their dreams. Such food as mice, rats, birds, snakes, grasshoppers must be caught and eaten secretly. It is forbidden, and if the camp guards learn about it, the prisoners will be punished. That was his letter. Some seriously ill prisoners have been allowed to go to hospitals outside the camp or return to their families, but others have not, and many have died in the camps without their families even being notified. It is official government policy, as stated in the 1976 PRG decree number, whatever that is, that terminally ill prisoners will be allowed to return to their families. Yet Amnesty International brought to Hanoi's attention cases of such prisoners not allowed to return. One such prisoner was Hoang Son, who died in August 1980 of stomach cancer in a detention camp. Another prisoner mentioned was the writer Huang, I knew I blew that all to pieces, who was sick for several months, but not transferred to a hospital until June 2nd, 1980. He died only 3 weeks later, just after he was finally given permission to return to his family. In the appendix of his book, Ifa wrote, Mon Amar Lucian Cronel, who was imprisoned in the camp and low-ranking officers, published a list of rules which he said was posted by the authorities in his camp. Other former prisoners have described the same rules existed in their camps. The authorities sought to maintain strict control over the thoughts of the prisoners, and to this end forbid prisoners from keeping and reading books or magazines of the former regime, reminiscing in conversation about imperialism in the puppet South, singing old love songs of the former regime, discussing political questions outside authorized discussion, harboring reactionary thoughts or possessing superstitious beliefs. It was also forbidden to be impolite to the cadre of the camp, and this rule has been abused to the point where the slightest indication of a lack of reverence to the cadre has been interpreted as rudeness and therefore harshly punished. Violations of these and other rules led to various forms of punishment, including being tied up in a contorted position, shackled in a connex box or dark cells, forced to work extra hours or reduced food rations. Many prisoners have been beaten, some to death, or subjected to very harsh forms of punishment due to the cruelty of certain camp officials and guards. Some have been executed, especially for attempting to escape. Some most brutal treatment occurs in camps in southern Vietnam among the Mekong Delta, where guards apparently have no fear of any reprimand for mistreating the prisoners. The connex boxes vary in size, but are generally large enough to accommodate a few prisoners crowded together. Some of the containers are made of wood, some of metal. The metal containers can become unbearable in the hot sun. Prisoners can pass out or die under such circumstances. Solitary confinement cells were also common in the camps, such as the Ray camp, where prisoners can receive 10 dark cells, had their hands and feet tied so tight they became afflicted with gangrene and lost their hands and feet or died. Other forms of confinement include tiger cage cells and abandoned wells. A prisoner in Long Con camp, a southern camp for low-ranking officers, was put in such a well for 5 days because he sang Silent Night on Christmas Eve. In some camps, such as Bengal, ditches called living graves by the prisoners are dug around the outer perimeter away from the main camp, but visible from the watchtower. Prisoners confined to these ditches in Bengal were fed once daily a bowl of rice or sorghum and water. Other forms of torture reported by former prisoners of Dam Duong camp, composed of about 1,000 prisoners, with 200 Montagnard tribal leaders, Highlanders. They were treated bad before we got there. They were treated even worse now. This is some of the tortures they had. Number one was the Honda. With the prisoner's hand and feet tied together, he is hung and swung back and forth while beaten. Nausea and vomiting often follow. Number two, the prisoner is tied butterfly style with thumbs tied together behind the back, one arm over the shoulder and the other pulled around the trunk of his body. In another version of this, the prisoner's outstretched legs are tied by the toes to the two middle fingers of the hand of the outstretched arms. A prisoner could be kept in such positions for weeks or even months. Another one, the airplane. The prisoner is tied either standing or to a pole, lying down or sitting on cement for various periods, depending on the prisoner's mistakes, 1 week, sometimes longer, sometimes a few days. As one would expect, prisoners released after such treatment are often unable to walk. A case where the airplane method was applied was described by Nguyen Ngoc Nam in his book, The Will of Heaven. This case occurred in May of 1977 at Viet Cong camp, located in the malaria jungles area near the Cambodian border. Truly, a prisoner became angry when he saw a guard using the flag of the former government of South Vietnam as a dust cloth. And you see where they're tied to the poles there, out in the sun. He took the flag out of the guard's hand and yelled at him for desecrating it. The next day, True was brought before the prisoners in a people's court, but instead of confessing his crime, True remained unrepentant, praising the flag and criticizing the comments. The outraged camp commander sentenced True to be tied to a wooden column outdoors, standing upright for 3 months. He was gagged and his hands were tied behind the back and around the post. His wrist lashed tightly with telephone wire. The wire cut through his flesh by the end of the first day. Forced to stand bareheaded all day long in the hot sun and the unusually cool nights of the highlands. Plagued by mosquitoes, True contracted malaria by the second week and became seriously ill. After a month, True was untied and carried to meet the camp commander's superior, who was visiting the camp that day and was given one more chance to repent. But True remained unrepentant and was taken out of camp the next day, never to be heard from again. Hanoi acknowledged that violence had in fact been directed against the prisoners, but it maintained that those were isolated cases and not indicative of general camp policy. Former prisoners, on the other hand, reported frequent beatings for minor infractions, such as missing work because of illness. In some cases, prisoners were beaten to death, such as Colonel Tham Ba Ham, accused of helping an escape attempt by other prisoners. He was bludgeoned before the other prisoners left without any medical treatment until he died. Other prisoners, a former non-commissioned Republic of Vietnam officer, insulted leaders of the Vietnamese Communist Party while delirious with fever and was beaten to death with chains. Why was delirious? Prisoners were being executed, most commonly for attempting to escape the camps. In some cases, they caught prisoners are tried by people's courts held before the other prisoners and then killed. Suicides were fairly common in camp. In one camp, a pharmacist who ended a letter to his wife asking her to pray for his return was brought before the other prisoners and berated for relying upon God for his release. For the next several nights, he was interrogated by camp authorities until he committed suicide. His family was not notified of his death. Family visits were important not only because of their personal need for prisoners and their loved ones to have contact with each other, but also because the families can bring food to their relatives in some of the camps. It has been reported that the prisoners in these camps could not survive without such food. However, the government does not allow many visits. Official regulations stated that prisoners in the camps could be visited by their immediate family once every 3 months. The duration of these visits were not long, reported by former prisoners to be last from 15 to 30 minutes. Moreover, family visits can be suspended for prisoners who break rules. Only families who have proven their loyalty to the regime are allowed visiting privileges. Amnesty International expressed its concern to the Hanoi government that visiting privileges were dependent on the prisoner's conduct and progress in reeducation, and stated its belief that a prisoner's rights to visits and correspondence should be inviolable and in no way conditional, except in cases of serious violation of camp discipline, and then only for a limited period. He also said that visits by family or a lawyer are not allowed. An officer may feel secured when ill-treating a prisoner, knowing that no one concerned about the prisoner's interests will see him or her soon and notice any signs of physical or mental deterioration. By the family not getting there, they can't see how bad they've been treated. The families of the prisoners were regarded as responsible for the acts of the prisoners before 1975. According to Hanoi spokesman Hoang Son, 1.3 million Vietnamese were part of the military or administrative apparatus of South Vietnam, members of so-called political parties or of mass organizations, which Son says were American-controlled. On the basis of this estimate, and on the estimate that there was an average of 5 members in each Vietnamese family, some concluded that there were 6.5 million Vietnamese who were compromised by ties with non-communist regime in South Vietnam. As a result of such logic, not only the prisoners, but also their families suffered discrimination in access to health care, employment, and higher education. As a way of redeeming their relatives for their past activities, families of Vietnamese ordered to report to the re-education camps were told in 1975 that they should urge their dear ones to devote themselves to reform study in order to retain the release of their imprisoned relatives to demonstrate they are good families. They have been pressured to move to the new economic zones. Some families of the prisoners had their food ration cards revoked until agreeing to move to these areas. In 1975 and 76 alone, more than 600,000 people were moved from Ho Chi Minh City or Saigon to these zones. In most instances, reportedly against their will, because of the barely tolerable living conditions in the new settlements. A considerable number of these people escaped or bribed their way back to the city. When the war was going on, a lot of people left the country and ended up in the city. And now the communists have taken over, they need to have people going back out and farming and so forth. The new economic zones came to be widely perceived as places of internal exile. In fact, the authorities who said to have used the threat of exile to such places against those who refused to obey party instructions or to participate in activities of those mass organizations. In September 1976, Premier Dam Duong declared that his compatriots, North and South, were translating the revolutionary heroism they had displayed in fighting into creative labor and the acquisition of wealth and strength. In the South, particularly, the old society was undergoing active changes as a result of stirring revolutionary movements. By the workers, peasants, youth, women, and intellectuals, and other groups. In agriculture alone, millions of people participate in bringing hundreds of thousands more hectares under cultivation and in building or dredging thousands of kilometers of canals and ditches, except there was not by choice. From all indications, however, these changes occurred more through coercion than volition. In Duong's own words, the party had initiated various policies aimed at eliminating the compadre capitalist as a class and doing away with all vestige of feudal exploitation. These policies radically realigned the power elite so that the ruling machine was controlled collectively by the putative vanguard of the working class, the party, and by the senior cadres of the party who were mostly from the North. In its quest for a new socialist order in the South, Hanoi relied on other techniques apart from socialist economic transformation and socialist reeducation. These included thought reform, population resettlement, and internal exile, as well as surveillance and mass mobilization. Party-sponsored study sessions were obligatory for all adults. The new economic zones theoretically were for a good purpose to increase food production, but actually were much more concentration camps located in malaria jungles areas where the land is very difficult to cultivate. Conditions in these areas are therefore not so different from life in the re-education camps, living under harsh conditions and in isolated areas. Thus, thousands of Vietnamese fled these areas and returned to the cities. In doing so, they became non-persons. In the eyes of the state, ineligible for food rations, an approved job, or housing, living in makeshift shelters on the streets of Saigon alone were as many as 15 to 20,000 people. Such people, according to a reporter who visited the country in 1980. Besides being pressured to move to the new economic zones, families of the prisoners have also been pressured to give up all their possessions to the state and work extra hours in order to demonstrate they are good families so that their relatives can now be released. The policy releasing prisoners from the refugee camps in Vietnam was a story of broken promises. The existence of the camps in itself a broken promise because it violates Article 11 of the 1973 Paris Agreement, which specifically prohibited such imprisonments. Another broken promise we have already noted occurred when the Vietnamese who had reported for re-education in June of 1975 were not released within 30 days. It has been clearly implied by the new regime when issued an order to report. In June 1976, the Provisional Revolutionary Government of South Vietnam, in one of its last policy announcements before the official reunification of Vietnam, stated that those in the camps would either be tried or released after 3 years of imprisonment. But this promise was also broken. Trials were never held, nor were prisoners in the camps released after 3 years. The excuses offered for the continued detention beyond the 3 years are increased security tensions with China in 1961 Resolution 49, which Hanoi argues supersedes the 1976 agreement, which allows for detention in the camps beyond the 3 years. According to Hoang Son, Resolution 49 allows for a new 3-year period to be established for those in the camps who did not sufficiently reform during the first 3 years. This announcement was over 7 years since the many of the prisoners were first arrested. In the words of Amnesty International, grounds for the continued detention of these people therefore seem to have been shifted from past misdeeds and present behavior to the external situation, namely national security. So if you'd already been there 7 years and then they added another 3 years, that gave you 10 years at the best. These prisoners are therefore being held in what is usually termed administrative detention without trial. The result of such prolonged, indefinite detention is severely hardship for the prisoners and their families. Since there was no clear criteria for releasing the inmates from the camps, bribery and family connections with high-ranking officials were more likely to speed up release than the prisoners' behavior. Released prisoners were put under probation and surveillance for 6 months to 1 year. And during this time, they had no official status, no exit visas, no access to government food rations, and no right to send their children to school. If the progress of the former prisoners is judged unsatisfactory during this period, they may be fired from their jobs, put under surveillance for another 6 months to a year, or sent back to the re-education camps. Approximately 60% of those released were rearrested. Careful examination of public records does indeed supply evidence that there was an execution program after 1975. It also supplies evidence that the executive execution program was politically in its intent rather than merely concerned with dealing with the crime wave that swept South Vietnam after the liberation. Who then were the victims of these summary executions? Among the victims were a number of government officials of the former regime, province chiefs, district chiefs, mayors, members of the police, high-ranking members of the army, and members of the intelligence community. The victims also included a handful of members of the former French leadership, a few leaders of popular ethnic or religious groups, a number of people who tried to escape from the country, and a large number of people who tried to escape from re-education camps. But by far the most widespread alleged reason for those executions was anti-government resistance. This region alone accounted for 49% of all the executions, including both armed resistance and passive resistance, such as refusal to register for re-education. Looking only at deaths that were due to active willful acts rather than passive neglect and using highly conservative coding and accounting procedures in the study of sample estimation, an estimated of approximately 65,000 persons were executed. This probably is an underestimate because the computations are based in part on the assumption that no more than 1 million people were processed through re-education camps. As a matter of fact, it is known that from 1985 statement by Nguyen Cao Thao that 2.5 million rather than 1 million people were through the education. So you could almost double that. The change in statistical parameters resulted from the recent admission would indicate that, in fact, possibly more than 100,000 Vietnamese people were victims of an extrajudicial execution in the last 10 years. The continued agony of thousands of Vietnamese went unnoticed by much of the world for years because of Hanoi's tight control over information and access to country. You couldn't get in. Few Western journalists were given access to the camps. Former prisoners said that even journalists from friendly communist countries were permitted to visit only after the camps had been transformed into showplaces in which guards sometimes masqueraded as prisoners, and props were brought in to create a brighter but false picture. As a condition of release, prisoners were required to swear that they would be never reveal what they experienced or saw. However, scores of refugees who have come to the United States over the years have told me that conditions in the camps were so brutal that some prisoners told a guard to shoot them to end their misery. In some cases, the guards complied. Often I wish I could die in the pain, said one torture victim, struggling to build a new life and erase old memories in San Jose, the new Saigon. He winced at the memory. It was so bad, so horrible, I don't think I will forget it, even if I'm dead. The residual brutality against the Vietnamese who supported the Americans and the Saigon regime may explain why the Vietnamese, who never left en masse during the centuries of occupation by the Chinese, French, and the Japanese, today are pouring out of their homeland by the thousands. Although the United States government knew of the suffering of the people who were staunch supporters during the war, it did little to spotlight the problem, relying on little publicized reports, low-key talks, and occasional congressional resolution. When U.S. officials asked in 1987 that the re-education camps prisoners be released to settle here in the United States, Hanoi finally agreed, but an official said that Hanoi had done nothing wrong by imprisoning the losing side of the war. Okay, that gets you an idea of how the re-education camps went. I know some friends of mine here, South Vietnamese military, they continued fighting after Saigon fell. They were captured. A friend of mine was a major, said he went from machine gun to, I think it was 12 or 15 years in re-education camps. And he was sent up north. Another friend of mine, who's my guide when I go back to Vietnam, he was given a stick and told to dig up landmines and so forth. Even today, if you go over as a tourist, it looks like everything is hunky-dory and fine, but the former South Vietnamese troops are still mistreated today. We have worked with the former South Vietnamese military here, the Vietnamese American community, and have taken money and supplies over to the former South Vietnamese soldiers who are arrested and sometimes taking the stuff away from them, and the Americans have been suggested they leave. So even though now it looks like everything is hunky-dory, there's still a lot of regression there. The Montagnard people are treated worse now than they were before. That kind of gives you an idea just how the reeducation camps and what happened after Saigon fell with the boat people and the reeducation camps and the economic zones and so forth. Listen, just want to let you know that our next show will be the 9th of August, 3 o'clock. The 7th of August would be in Raleigh at the Capitol for the last 34 years, I think it is now. The 7th of August would be the first Saturday at 12 o'clock noon. We'll be calling out the names of the 38 from North Carolina who's still missing from the Vietnam War. It's also the POW/MIA Purple Heart Day. That is National Purple Heart Day. There'll be a lot of Purple Heart recognition going on around the place and so forth. And the day before that, August the 2nd, was the original day of Gulf of Tonkin incident. Was August 2nd. The one in Reeducation was August 4th. But that is the show for the day. I hope you found out some things you didn't know about. I think you appreciate just how the comments were. I'm hoping that Afghanistan does not end up the same way because these guys, they're now talking, the South Vietnamese soldiers I've talked to, they don't have post-traumatic stress. I don't know exactly why, but they've gone through what they've gone through, but a lot of them I know have got ill health. So I hope you enjoy the rest of your July, and I'll see you the second week in August.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section at nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by StreamingGear.com, Carolina Apparel, and DeltaForce.net.